Hello, my name is Carmen, and I am a PhD student in the psychology department at McMaster University. And in this presentation, I'm going to be discussing our study comparing plot structure and character agency in diegetic versus mimetic narratives. Narratives have had a long history of evolution, from telling stories around bonfires and at rituals in prehistoric times to developing writing systems to record these stories and performing them on stage. In terms of visual storytelling, dyes and rocks were used to create cave paintings, and eventually, paints and canvases were developed, and then cameras and photography came along, which made way for the moving image and gave rise to films and television. And even more recently, we now have video games and other types of interactive and participatory narrative formats. An important type of narrative distinction to make is that between diegetic and mimetic narratives. Diegesis is Greek for narration, so diegetic narratives are narratives that are told, for instance, folktales and novels. Mimesis, on the other hand, is Greek for imitation, so mimetic narratives are narratives that are performed, portrayed, and enacted, such as in films and video games. But within diegesis and mimesis, we can also subdivide these narrative formats into short and long narratives. So the goal of our study is to conduct cross-media comparisons between these narrative formats. We propose that character psychology is the basis of plot structure. By this, we mean that plot is made of the emotional shifts or the rises and falls of the protagonist in the story. So, for instance, you can have a plot where there is first an emotional rise, and then a fall, and then a final emotional rise. And then you can have the same prototypical shape and extend it by either 1 or 2 cycles, or so on. You can also have a plot shape where there is first a fall and then a rise, and you can also extend that plot shape similarly. Essentially, you can classify plot shapes based on the valence of the beginning and the ending. I just described the N and the V shapes, both of which have happy endings, but you can also have the reverse, where there is a happy beginning and sad end, or a sad beginning and sad end. We call this the resonator model because these plot shapes can expand in length while the endpoints remain constant, similarly to what I showed on the previous slide. Plots with happy beginnings are also known as striving plots because they involve an emotional rise, and those are usually caused by a protagonist striving for something, while plots with sad beginnings are often known as coping plots because those are plots that involve an emotional fall at the beginning of the story where the protagonist is coping against an oppressive external force. Stories are often discussed in terms of their endings, for instance, comedies and tragedies, but then with the resonator model, it proposes that plots can be described in addition to its ending, but also by the valence of its beginning. And so that is what this 2x2 model is showing. You may recognize that these plot shapes are similar to Vonnegut's plot waves, which he described as being reversals of fortune for the protagonist. And in brackets below, you can see Vonnegut's corresponding names for these plot shapes. But a subtle difference between Vonnegut's reversals and the rises and falls described in the resonator model is that the resonator model describes emotional rises and falls experienced and instigated by the protagonist, as opposed to events that happen to the protagonist. In addition to the plot being made of the emotional shifts, these emotional shifts also reflect and correspond to the problem-solving arc of the protagonist in the story. And so this is a graphic from a paper that we published a few years ago to show that the problem-solving arc, and therefore the plot, is driven by the protagonist. And so a few years ago, we proposed a plot model known as the embodied plot model that outlines the major components of this problem solving arc, such as the emotional appraisals, the motivation, the decision making, the goal planning, and the action undertaking. And looking at this story grammar, you can see where the potential rises and falls can occur in this arc. So when we say that we view character psychology as plot structure, we mean that we can classify plot shapes based on the protagonist's emotional appraisals. Plot structure is embodied by the protagonist and is composed of their psychological processes during problem solving. And character psychology has much more explanatory power than a linear event sequence, such as, say, the hero's journey or the 3 or 5 act structure. There were two main measures in this study. One of them being the number of emotional shifts that occur in the story, which we predict to be an indicator of plot length, and the other measure being agency, which we conceptualize as being the proportion of the total number of shifts that are driven by the protagonist. Our cross-media comparisons consisted of 4 corpora of narratives. We selected 470 folktales, 12 novels, 45 films, and 9 video games. We had a rater per corpora, and each rater mapped out the plot arc of each story based on the embodied plot story grammar, and they then graphed the resonator timeline of emotional shifts. So how does this coding look like? For example, here is one folktale that we coded, The Frog King by the Grimm brothers. And we first mapped out the problem-solving arc based on the embodied plot model story grammar. And as you can see, there are 2 problem-solving cycles that the protagonist goes through and 4 emotional shifts. The shifts are color-coded red if they were driven by the protagonist, and they were color-coded black if the event occurred in the story world outside of the protagonist's control. We then created the corresponding resonator graph that quantifies the magnitude and valence of the emotional shift of each progression or step in the embodied plot model on a scale from -2 to +2. When you look at the resonator graph, which is a reflection of the embodied plot model graph, you can see that the story takes on a W shape, or a fall-rise plot shape. Looking at the results for the comparisons between short and long diegetic narratives, we see that folktales have on average 4.7 emotional shifts, and 58% of them being protagonist-driven. On the other hand, novels had 14 emotional shifts on average, with only 38% of them being protagonist-driven. It was expected that novels would have more emotional shifts since novels are a much longer text with a nearly tenfold difference in word count, but curiously, it had less agency than folktales. And so this difference in agency between folktales and novels may be attributed to how condensed folktales are. So protagonist actions are more emphasized. So, for instance, folktales would describe Jack from Jack and the Beanstalk as doing this and doing that, but novels would instead focus more on the protagonist's thought processes. In looking at mimetic narratives, films have on average 11 emotional shifts, 44% of them being protagonist driven, while video games have on average 44.6 emotional shifts, so a nearly tenfold difference. And 46% of those 44 emotional shifts were protagonist driven. And so the degree of agency between films and video games are very similar. In comparing narratives across all 4 media types between diegetic and mimetic narratives, we see that novels have more shifts than films, but films have more agency. And so this difference in agency may be because films are a short but mimetic medium or actions, and therefore protagonist change are more explicit and emphasized. In comparing novels and video games have many more shifts than novels, and it also has more agency. And again, video games are action-based mimetic medium. It's also important to note that video games take on average 22.8 hours to complete, but when you consider how long it takes to read novels, it takes a similar amount of time to complete a novel, usually between 10 and 20 hours, depending on the length of the novel. So novels and video games actually have similar consumption durations, but video games have many more emotional shifts, which may be because of its action-based and participatory nature. When comparing all four corpora together, folktales surprisingly had the highest degree of agency, and it was statistically different from the agency values from the other corpora. And while more analyses need to be done in order to understand why folktales have such a high percentage of agency, its short length may be a contributing factor. There are some important implications in conducting cross-media plot comparisons. One implication is that narratives may not have a universal plot structure, and so traditional plot models, such as the hero's journey or the five-act structure, may not be suitable to apply to plot analyses across media. Well, we found that the Resinger model and the embodied plot models are able to reveal differences in key plot features across different media formats. And so different narrative formats have different plot features, such as the number of emotional shifts of the protagonist in a story being a marker of the length of a narrative format. And as we saw, folktales had the fewest number of emotional shifts, while video games had the most, almost 10 times more. Another difference in plot feature is protagonist agency, which we conceptualize as being a protagonist-driven actions. And protagonist agency is portrayed differently across media formats. And we saw that based on the criteria we use to measure agency, that novels had the least amount of agency, surprisingly, and folktales having the most. And finally, some limitations of this methodology are the fact that our models are quite action-based. And so the models identify protagonist actions, but there may be other markers of agency that we aren't capturing. And another limitation is the potential variability in the coding, where different coders may identify emotional shifts differently. In terms of next steps, since this is an exploratory study, we can also look at multi-protagonist stories and determine whether these stories have shorter plot lengths and whether stories with more central characters would condense the plot lengths of each of these central characters. Another measure that we can analyze is the frequency of different types of plot shapes in different media formats. So, for example, are certain plot shapes common in particular media formats? So to give you a quick preview of what the plot shape analysis would look like, if you remember from the previous slide, I discussed the N and the V-shaped plots of the Resinger model, as well as their inverses. And so we propose that there are four main plot shapes, but are certain shapes more common in certain media formats? So when you look at the distribution of plot shapes across media formats, you can see that each media format has a very different plot distribution profile. The N plots are plots with happy beginnings, otherwise known as stories where the protagonist starts off striving for something. Most folktales are stories with N plots, and interestingly, folktales also had the highest degree of agency, so there may be a correlation between those factors. The plots are stories with sad beginnings, or in other words, the plots are stories where the protagonist starts off coping against an external oppressor. And so novels have an equal number of N and V plots, but films and video games are dominated by V plots, or these coping plots. And they also had a lower degree of agency than folktales, despite being mimetic narratives. And so, as you can see, there is still a lot to explore. And we also, compared to folktales, we also had smaller sample sizes for films, novels, and video games. So, more has to be done in order to better understand the factors that are contributing to these plot differences. And so that concludes my presentation. My email is listed here if you want to connect. And thank you so much for listening.